good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The Cabinet has agreed to a proposal to put limits on a Prime Minister's tenure. It's a move framed as a reform to strengthen democratic safeguards. But in a parliamentary system like Malaysia's, term limits raise complex questions around the legal and political arena. So tonight on the show, we'll unpack the nuance behind what sounds like a very simple reform. And joining me on the show to do this is constitutional law expert and legal scholar, Professor Emeritus Datuk Dr. Shad Saleem Faruqi, and also political scientist, Professor Wong Chin Huat. He's the Deputy Head of Strategy for the Asia headquarters of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network at Sunway University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today. Prof. Shad, if I may begin with you very briefly, let's look at what the underlying democratic problem that this proposal is trying to solve. So when we look at a prime ministerial term limit in Malaysia, what problem is that trying to address?
Thank you very much, Melissa, for having us. As to the question, are there any problems associated with the unlimited term or time that a PM can be in office? At the moment, at this particular moment, with PMX and the previous three prime ministers, there is obviously no problem. But in the past, there were two long-serving PMs, Tunku for 13 years, and Tun Mahathir for, I think, 22 plus 2 is 24 years. Now, my support for reform, and I'm sure Professor Wong will be with me on this, our support for this reform is not because Malaysia is on the precipice of some serious problem. I think our support for this reform is for reasons of democracy and good governance. It is an aspect of good governance and democratic idealism that there should be elective leadership renewal from time to time. Leadership change is a shield against the possibility of what is often called elected dictatorship or democratic despotism. That sounds a little bit harsher. Now, time or term limits are a necessary democratic safeguard against authoritarian rule. If power is concentrated in a single leader over a long period of time, there is danger of this power becoming personalized. I know at one time in India they used to say Indra is India and India is Indra. So it was all very personalized. So there is a danger of power becoming personalized with resulting abuses, not just by the Prime Minister, but by his family, by his clan, and by his political party. So any change or reform becomes difficult in a country like this unless the Prime Minister, the authoritarian leader, desires it. Many of the challenges the nation is facing today, in my view, and I apologize if this would offend anyone, many of the problems we are facing today are actually because of the misjudgments of the past. But because the leaders were powerful and their tenure was absolutely secure, adjustments could not be made. So the default of past leaders, what are some of these problems? I think are frayed ethnic relations. They are becoming worse. At one time we were the exemplar for Asia and Africa on intercommunal relationships. But now that is not so. Problems of endemic corruption, decline of the education system, frayed relations with Sabah and Sarawak, which actually under the constitution were very special relationships, decline of all check and balance institutions. So we need to build safeguards against repetition of such mistakes.
Right.
I'll just make one more point. If the leader is in power for too long, then there tends to be a very top-down system of governance. There is minimum consultation with affected interests. Now, in my view, democracy is not simply voting once in 5 years. Democracy is actually participatory democracy, participation in the making of decisions, even in the making of laws. That's democracy. In country after country, when the same leader or coalition hold the reins of power decade after decade, democracy often transforms into elected dictatorship. A time or term limit will reduce the concentration of power, corruption and nepotism. Examples are Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe was leader for 37 years.
Wow.
In Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, 21 years. In Zaire, Mobutu Seko, 32 years. Now, there are many other such examples. Now, the constitutional lesson of these cases are that institutions of the state under the law become weak. Civil service becomes politicized. Corruption becomes systemic. It's just part of the system. Policy planning gets tied up with regime survival. Succession becomes destabilizing.
Right.
So I think that's what I'm concerned with. We don't want these mistakes to occur again or to be repeated.
So it's a good thing that we're moving towards putting some limits into any unchallenged tenure or elected dictatorship, as you used the phrase a bit earlier. But you used the phrase time or term limit a bit earlier, Prof. And that's where I want to explore the different models of limitation. I may come to you, Chin Huat. When we think about the number of years versus the number of terms, help me think through the differences, the good and the bad, the pros and the cons.
Sure. Now, when we think about term limit, very naturally we think about presidential system, which has
like
been
the
an
US.
established norm for most presidential system. In parliamentary system, this is relatively new, but we are not the first one. We have example in 3 regions in the world. One is Southern Africa, South Africa and Botswana. Second is the Caribbean coastal area that cover Cayman Island, Belize, and Guyana, and both Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago are discussing about this. The third is actually Southeast Asia. We had Thailand before us.
Yes.
So we are looking at a new norm, and this is where things get interesting, because that if we have a good design, this may eventually be emulated by other countries.
Okay.
Now, in some countries, the story is very straightforward. You have a 2-party system. Then when you are what you are thinking is about the guy has to go after 2 terms, right? So you may not think about the complexity. But in some systems, like South Africa, they actually thought it through. So they actually they asked these very important questions. That would be the key challenge in our design for a parliamentary system. When you say term, what happens when you have an incomplete or partial term? For example, you have a mid-term change of government. Within the same parliament, do you count both terms as full terms? So more likely you would count the one that started after election as 1 term, regardless what. But what about the guys who come in mid-term? Would you count it as a first term? So in South Africa, they make it explicit that you wouldn't count it as a first term. So your first term means that you have to start after election. Now, this is where we come to the issue. One is about how do we count the terms? Because in parliamentary system, the executive term and legislative term are intertwined, and they can vary with in length. Second, which make it even more complicated, we normally have an interregnum between one legislative term and the next. What it means in Malaysia is that between the last day of the last parliament and the first day of the next parliament, when the parliament was resummoned, reconvened, you could have up to a gap of 120 days.
Right.
Now, that is shared by the last Prime Minister as the caretaker during elections until the new Prime Minister is appointed. And then the new Prime Minister has a period of time in power before the Parliament is convened. So in designing the term, we have to deal with these two. The main problem is actually about the partial term. So if we're going to stick with 2 terms, and now we say we would not count the term before it, the intermediate, the mid-term partial term.
Right.
So you think of, like, let's say, Tun Razak, Tun Hussein on, even Mahathir, you don't count that part when they first came in.
Okay, so that highlights, I think, the nuance of
Yeah.
having a 2-term limit. Can you maybe just describe the limitations of a 10-year
Yeah,
total?
sure.
So how does that work? How do we count what 10 years entail?
Yeah, if we count as tenure, we just basically allow a Prime Minister, anyone to be a Prime Minister, to accumulate his or her terms up to 10 years. So that's
Is
relatively
that
simple.
cumulative?
Yes.
Okay.
That's relatively simple. What we need to deal with is only interregnum, the part that the residual we can technically resolve, right? But you have a term. The problem is this. If you do not count the partial term, then someone who want to stay very long, you could get a seat warmer to take the first year or first few months, and then you get almost another full term, right? After 2 full term, you can get another guy to come in again, and then you would have it again. Now, if you go the opposite, you now become very rigid. You would count even a partial term, starting in the midterm, as one. Then a smart politician would not want to take up that job, right? But when you have a midterm succession, it could be because of a crisis. That would deprive us a situation where you can't get the best political
The
mind.
best person for the
job.
job. Absolutely. Prof. Shad, that seems to me that the design of the law, the design of this constitutional amendment is so key in making explicit what we mean by putting limits on a Prime Minister's tenure. How do you think about some of the ways we can do this without unintended outcomes?
Unintended outcomes will be impossible to avoid. In law, there are always good purposes, good aims, but when the law works, there are always some issues that come up. Could I just go back a little bit? You were talking about terms or time. There is a possible third possibility.
Oh.
And that is this, that a person could be limited to 2 consecutive terms, but someone else gets elected. After that, someone else's term comes to an end, this person can come back.
So it doesn't have to be consecutive.
Yeah. Like in America, the 2 consecutive terms. But in some countries that is possible, that actually once someone else has filled a term, you can come back. So that will meet the objection that we have a great leader, a visionary, charismatic, we need him. Well, if he's so good, we can give him a chance to come back. So that's a third possibility. But
That's actually the system in Cayman Island.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it has been tried and tested.
They basically force you to take a cooling off period. But if your whole idea is to prevent someone to be in power, that may not be sufficient. Because that cooling off period could be a proxy.
The seat warmer
Yes,
that
exactly.
you talked about earlier. I'm curious to know from where you stand whether having these different permutations of term versus time versus a mix of the both,
Mixed system, yes.
a mixed system, whether the type of model and how much the public understands it, is that important? How much the public understands and trusts these types of permutations or the design of the Constitution. How important is that in trying to get maybe the buy-in or the social license from from people. I will ask you.
Yeah, I think politicians, if they are rational, they should support this, because unless you're in power, to have a term limit shorten the time for you to get up there. So the first outcome is that you're going to have guaranteed generational renewal. At some point, you're going to get a younger leadership. So anyone who is young, who have not been up there, who is not a prime minister, you should support that. And for parties who have not come to power, you should support that, because if there's a change of government, there's opening for you to win, right? It's a question now for ordinary people to see why does it matter to you. And I would say there are three reasons. One, as I mentioned, is about leadership renewal. Second, when people can actually project how long that you have to wait, you don't fight in the queue. This is just very simple reason, right? If you happen to be in a toilet and there's a long queue, but the guy never come out, at some point people just get uneasy. And that what it means in politics is that we can reduce political instability. We reduce political power struggle, because all you need to do is just to wait, because you know the waiting can't be too long, 10 years. Now the third one that is important is that whoever in power, you get discipline. You know that you don't have an indefinite timing. So what you want to do, what you want to carry out, you got to get it done. You cannot assume that you'll be there forever just to win an elections and delay.
Right.
So overall, it makes governance much more disciplined. And that's the most important
Can
thing.
you help me think that through? So I understand the discipline that it might force the Prime Minister to have in terms of governance. But does that allow for, or encourage or incentivize short-termism? Because you're thinking about the deadline. So you are already worried about what's going on, what's going to happen, or is it the opposite? Does it allow for bolder reforms, doing things that you know are politically difficult or require a lot of political capital as you're approaching the end of your eligibility?
If you look at the case in presidency system, what people would say is that second-term president, even though some may say they suffer from a lame duck effect, but also they become bolder, because you don't worry about election.
Bolder, yes.
You would just do what you want to do. And what you would think about is that how do you plan to win your second elections, and in that period of whether it's 8 years or 10 years, you want to get things done. You do not have this illusion that time is on at your side. This is something almost like in life, right? If we believe that you may die tomorrow, you would live today to the fullest.
Prashad?
Actually, that's a very important point, that if it's a 2-term limit, then the Prime Minister in his second term would likely be a little bit bolder, more visionary, because he wants history to remember him. Whereas if it is unlimited number of terms, the important thing is to win the election.
Right.
I'll do good, but later on. So I think there is too much populism. I know that in England sometimes prime ministers are eager to get laws passed, but it's controversial. So they will not themselves promote the law. They will get a private MP to introduce a private member's bill.
Right.
But here, sadly, in Malaysia, there has never been a private member's bill passed.
Yes.
Many have been introduced, but there has never been a private member's bill. Never. Now, this is something that actually PMs or the ruling parties should exploit in a nice way. If it's an issue that would attract, let us say, 3 hours in Malaysia, or an issue of economy which is controversial, people will likely get angry with the government. Let a private member introduce the bill and very diplomatically tell your MPs, you're free to vote according to your conscience.
I understand. Okay, when I think about the term limit, say in the presidential system, it's very easy to understand. But with Malaysia, because we don't have a fixed term act,
Yes.
that adds another layer of complexity. Would it be easier if we did push for a fixed term act, Prof. Wong?
I think fixed term act would be a good complement to this, but it would not be a prerequisite. The reason being is that if you have a fixed term, to most understanding, what it means is that the Prime Minister cannot seek early dissolution at any time he or she wishes, like what happened in Japan.
Yeah.
So what it means is that normally come into two conditions. One, you have lost the confidence, so the Parliament has the power to sack you, and you have the counter power to say, let's go for election. We wouldn't know who's the people actually would support, right? Second is that you get a cross-party consensus. So normally a two-third supermajority, that two-thirds of the MPs say we should go for an election to settle this deadlock. Then you go that. Now, so that would actually help to discipline Prime Minister, because you're not thinking of like, should I actually call an election now that I would have a longer time? Together with a term limit, naturally, someone who wins an election as a new Prime Minister, you want to serve 2 terms. That's what looks almost like the presidential.
I understand. Right. So, gentlemen, I have to ask you what you see as the best design of this law. It will require a constitutional amendment, but as lawmakers think this through, what would you hope that what permutation would you hope they land on? Prof. Shad, may I begin with you?
Personally, I favor the 10-year limit rather than the 2-term, because when it comes to 2 terms of whom? 2 terms of Parliament or 2 terms of the Prime Minister? So I prefer this 10 years, but at the same time I have to confess to you that even in this 10-year rule, there are some issues which are uncertain. Along with 10 years, the PM may also be a caretaker for up to 120 days. He may also be interim if the Yang di-Pertuan takes time to set up a unity government or a minority government if there is no one in a majority in a hung parliament. So this issue will have to be decided in Parliament during the debates, whether this 10-year time limit will include this extra period of 120 days where Parliament is dissolved. Technically, the PM doesn't have any support in Parliament because there is no more Parliament.
That's right.
But nevertheless, he is a caretaker. By the way, the Constitution nowhere mentions caretaker prime ministers. So it is merely a convention that we have borrowed from the UK. And then, of course, the other factor is this. Sometimes, as we were talking about it earlier, in Belgium, the interim prime minister stayed in power for 19 months.
Wow.
So I think this issue will have to be decided. But all in all, I feel these are matters that can, with clever drafting, can be resolved.
Okay, so you prefer the 10-year.
10 year
Yes.
rule.
What about you?
Same, for
You
10
do,
years.
okay.
And to resolve the problems of interregnum, I would suggest this, that when the time is up, the Prime Minister would be considered to have resigned, only waiting for the new Prime Minister to be appointed. So that basically whatever residual days a week, you can just ignore it for simplicity. What would be the real challenge is that if you have a Prime Minister who won elections and continue for 2 terms, now that definitely would spend more than 10 years, right? Because you have part of the first 120 days, you have also between 2 elections, maybe 1 month at least, 2 months plus at least, right? Yes. So which means that if you rigid it to exactly 10 years, this guy would have to resign a few months before
Before the next-
parliament go for full term. So there's a simple solution. What we would argue is that if the Prime Minister tenure limits end within the last 6 months of the parliamentary term, he or she would be allowed to continue until the
Okay.
full term. So that we resolve that
So
problem.
there are terms and conditions added
Yes,
to
but
this.
relatively easy.
Okay, relatively easy.
Easy.
Good. I'm so happy that both of you have helped me think this through, because I think there is a lot of nuance around what
Yes.
is framed as a very direct, straightforward democratic reform. But thank you for helping us think this through before it gets into the the grey areas.
Yes. May I add one more thing?
Sure.
Very little. Most people might be thinking that this part would come in under 43.2, talking about appointment of Prime Minister by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, so that the 10-year limits becomes a constraining factor on the eligibility. Now, that could be problematic, because when you get into that part, it becomes non-justiciable. So that's mean the court cannot actually examine, because we had previous case before. So the easiest solution is to have it under 43 clause 7, where actually it imposes a constraint on eligibility. That is, if you're not born in Malaysia, you cannot be a prime minister. So what we need to do is to put it there. If you have served 10 years, you cannot be appointed.
Okay.
So that solves the problem.
So you have to, with constitutional law, I'm sure you have to spell it all out, which is why I think, Prof. Shad, your main concern essentially is in how the real world implementation of this.
Well, the real world, the ordinary people will not go into such sophisticated details. To them, someone who is charismatic, someone who makes the boldest promises. I think populism is not something that should be taken much note of in drafting the Constitution, in drafting this change, because this change has to take note of the real technical problems that are arising.
Yeah.
I know that this will sound undemocratic, but public opinion is good for ordinary issues. There are some issues where actually you need to have more sophisticated reasoning.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you so much for helping us think this through. I appreciate your time and your insights. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.